Well, the increase in year-round sports is leading to new sets of injury issues with young athletes. One is called Little League shoulder. That results from youngsters throwing too much without taking a break. Young athletes typically need time off from a sport spanning at least 3 months. Year-round sports is a natural outgrowth of our intensely competitive society, and maybe a parent's hope that their youngster is on his way to becoming the next great major league all-star pitcher. With us to talk about injury concerns in young athletes are Dr. John Johnson, who serves as the athletic director at Shawnee Mission South, where he also teaches government, economics, and law. He's also coached baseball. Dr. Johnson, nice to have you. Welcome.
Thank you.
Dr. Randy Goldstein's also here. He's a pediatrician and sports injury specialist over at St. Luke's. Dr. Goldstein, nice to have you too. Welcome.
Thank you, Steve.
Well, why are we seeing injuries earlier in youth, Dr. Johnson? I mean, what's different in how kids are playing now versus, say, 10 years ago?
Well, I think the biggest part of it is the year-round demand on these young athletes.
They're not getting a break.
They're not. They go from one sport to another, and many times, probably in the last 5 years, the big phenomenon is they'll double book themselves. They'll be in a high school sport in volleyball, for example, but then being playing club soccer.
Dr. Goldstein, you're nodding your head as Dr. Johnson's talking. You've seen some of this.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Not only is the single sport getting more yearly growth and not having the summer break as we used to, but they're perhaps playing more than one sport, or like Dr. Johnson said, playing on more than one team in the same sport.
Mm-hmm. Is that kind of concentration a good idea? What would you advise a parent?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that we're having less fun and having more competition. And when we can reverse that equation to having more fun and concentration less on competition, we'll get more wins in the end.
Less fun and more competition. Does that ring a bell to you, Dr. Johnson?
Absolutely. I think it's very clear by the research that kids participate in sports mainly by far to have fun. That doesn't mean they don't need to be held accountable for behavior and being coachable. But the bottom line is if they don't have fun, my experience is by the time they become sophomores, juniors, seniors in high school, they start to burn out.
Yeah.
If it's not fun, in high school you can find a million other things you'd like to do.
I was going to say, there's some stat out there that suggests that so many kids aren't sticking with sports these days because they burn out, to use your term.
Well, they burn out. There's a lot of research out there that indicates that kids leave because they've had a bad experience with a parent or a coach. There's a research that I give my parents when we have our meetings that indicate, for example, that the part of the athletic experience the kids don't like the most is the ride home after the game. So the bottom line...
Meaning that the mom or dad is letting them have it.
They are. They're breaking down the game. They want to talk about it, and the kids just want to go get something to eat. Mm-hmm. And they'll deal with it another time. And I think it's just really important to understand that fun is what engages these kids, and it becomes the link for their activity.
And to what extent are you seeing parents becoming a bigger and bigger issue as the years pass in your work?
Well, 97% of our parents are outstanding and they just let it happen. I think that the parents that vicariously want to experience the success of a child can be harmful to that child. It puts a lot of undue pressure on that child because for that child, their excellence in sports may just be a byproduct of what they want to do. It's not who they are.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, Dr. Goldstein, let's talk about young pitchers and what should be the limit on how much they pitch and how often. I mentioned in the opening this whole idea of little league shoulder. What are you seeing out there, and what would you advise a parent of a pitcher?
Good. So little league elbow and little league shoulder are both injuries to an open growth plate that widens because of too much stress or too many throws. Mm-hmm. That is common, and we've seen it for the eternity of baseball. Perhaps we're seeing it more because of shows like this educating parents and coaches to look for it, and so they're better at coming to the doctor when their child is not throwing as accurately or is having pain. Possibly also because of what was mentioned earlier, that they're playing more often, and so we're seeing it more often because kids are getting hurt in their winter off-season throwing practices. And maybe because they're playing on two teams, and maybe the coach doesn't even know that they just pitched the day before on another team. And so when
And that happens, you got kids who are pitching in a game one day and coming back for the high school team and pitching in that game the next day.
for sure, although
mean,
that's
that
not
just-
the recommendations.
Right. That
That
just
does
strikes
happen.
me as a recipe for all kinds of issues.
Well, certain people's goals are very high, and in those rules, the more you play, the better chance I have to succeed becomes the rule.
Yeah.
And often an injury gets in the way of that.
What do you recommend in terms of how much pitching any one youngster should be undertaking?
Good. So there's recommendations by the American Academy of Pediatrics as well as Major League Baseball and all the youth baseball leagues that fall under Major League Baseball. And there's pitch counts based on your age, and there's times to take breaks, including not going just from a pitching position to a catching position the next inning. Because although a catcher doesn't have the velocity and direction necessary, they have just the amount of frequency of throws.
Mm-hmm.
So taking days off after pitching, taking a month off at a time, up to 3 months a year at a month staggered each time to give the arm a rest, but also to give not only the arm a rest, the brain a rest too, to get a chance to recover from that sport before going to the next season.
Dr. Johnson, how often are you seeing Little League shoulder cropping up in your work at Shawnee Mission South?
Well, I don't see it in the context of Dr. Goldstein, but what we do see, the Kansas State High School Activity Association has passed pitch count rules.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have more kids that are pitchers now, which I think is kind of by demand. But those limits are pretty strict, and I haven't seen what I consider to be really dead arms or anything like that recently. The coaches are pretty well in tune with appropriate use of their pitchers in high school.
What is a typical pitch count for a junior in high school? Do you know off the top of your
Well,
head?
you're maxed out at 105 pitches.
That's still a lot of pitches.
It is a lot
That's
of
a major
pitches.
league count. That's what the major leaguers go for.
And then they're off. They have to take a mandatory off 4 days, and you gradually go down. If you, I think it's 49, and then you can pitch 2 days later, and you gradually go up.
Mm-hmm. Does that make sense to you, Dr. Goldstein?
That's the normal guideline is 105 in high school. Realize that Little League elbow and Little League shoulder, you have to have an open growth plate, and so many of those patients are junior high and grade school kids. And by the time they make it to high school, their growth plates are closed, and they're having new problems like ulnar collateral ligament tears, what the Tommy John surgery comes from, and other issues that don't have to do with the growth plate. So,
So Tommy
we're
John
seeing them down
surgery,
to
you hear so much about that at the major league level. You're associated with it too, even at the high school level?
At the high school and college level for sure. And there are some places, not that I'm aware of in Kansas City, but there are some places in the country that do prophylactic ulnar collateral ligament surgeries.
What does that mean?
Before the injuries even happen. They replace it with something stronger because they're so sure their kid's going to go to the major leagues.
Get out of here. To actually do it as a preventative.
Not that
kinda-
I'm aware of in Kansas City, but in the United States, yes.
Well, that's breathtaking to me. Yeah. Well, we're talking about youth sports and injuries associated with those sports. If you want to join our conversation, we have a couple of great experts here. 816-235-2888 is our phone number, or you can tweet us at KCUR Up to Date. Dr. Goldstein, Little League shoulders from throwing, an excessive overhead motion. Does it happen to softball players too? Are you seeing that as well?
It's a great question. So we see Little League shoulder and Little League elbow mostly in the overhead athlete, which would include baseball pitchers, number one. But it happens in position players as well in softball and baseball, and happens in the gymnast because it's an overhead athlete, happens in some track events such as javelin or shot put. It's anything that we're doing excessively under a load, so under a weight or under an excessive, over and over force with open growth plates. So it doesn't just happen to baseball pitchers, but that's certainly the majority of what we see.
Yeah. John Johnson, again, at Shawnee Mission South, what are you seeing in terms of overall participation in sports these days at your high school? Is it on the way up? Is it staying steady, dropping? What's happening?
I would say it would essentially be static and on the way up. I don't see any reduction in the numbers of participation, which is really good for our school. What I would like to see more of is participation of multiple sport athletes. One of the things that I try to tweet out as much as I possibly can are all those anecdotal examples of multiple sport athletes that get drafted in the NFL, for example. I think something like 83% ran track. We're looking for kids that do multiple sports, and I meet with a lot of recruiters, and invariably somebody will say, what else does he do besides football, or what else does she do besides basketball?
Because you're seeing a greater emphasis on kids just specializing in one sport. Is that what you're saying?
We try to avoid that. There seems to be that trend to specialize because parents
parents think that's the way to get a kid into the NFL or Major League Baseball?
Maybe more scholarship related, to go to college. I think that sometimes that's short-sighted because that multiple sport athlete will most likely get more looks than that one and only sport athlete.
Dr. Goldstein, again, you're nodding your head. Multiple sports, that would be your recommendation?
So in 2015 in the NFL Combine, 87% of the players admitted to playing multiple sports.
87%.
And I think Patrick Mahomes is a fantastic explanation and great description for Kansas City. Not only is he an excellent player and a great addition to Kansas City, but he played multiple sports and made it to the top. And it just proves to the parents and the athletes that think if I don't play year-round soccer or year-round baseball, and that's the only sport I dedicate my time to, I just won't make it. But the truth is that, the odds of being a high school football player and making it to the pros is about 1 in 6,000, and that's about the same in every sport. High school basketball, about 1 in 10,000 make it to the pros. A high school soccer player has about a 1 in 90 chance of making it to a Division I or Division II NCAA team. And so you could play multiple sports and still achieve greatness, as we see in NFL players today. And the burnout is less when you play multiple sports. The overuse injury, such as Little League elbow and Little League shoulder, is less when you play multiple sports. And certainly the fun is more when you entertain yourself with more than one thing to do during the entire year. Yet we know that year-round sport is vital to coaches and athletes and parents that are dedicated to that sport. At least during that year-round time, if you're a year-round soccer player or year-round baseball player, at least during some of that time, mix it up with something that doesn't have anything to do with that sport. For instance, swimming or an off-team time.
Right. Do your athletes have any sense of what Dr. Goldstein was just laying out here, the statistics that suggest that any one athlete's chance of making it to the pros really aren't very good?
Yeah, I think they have a really good idea.
Oh, they do? Okay.
But, for them, we don't want to restrict their dreams and their aspirations. There's a kid from our school from 2009 that pitched in the major leagues, Mike Moran, and he was a big kid, but he was the first part of his high school career. He was a multi-sport athlete, and so they know that the odds are long. We don't want to take them away from their dream, but the big deal is they have to be realistic about it.
And I would add that yes, somebody has to be that 1 in 6,000, and it could be your kid, and I agree with that. Somebody has to be the one person that makes it to the pros. What we want to try to prevent is the injury or the burnout that occurs that really makes them not one of those 1 out of 6,000.
Yeah.
So sure, your kid could be that person. Somebody is. We want to make sure that your burnout is decreased, your injury is decreased, your fun is increased to make that reality.
Well, just for the record, I tell the little kids in my neighborhood that I played for the Packers back in the 80s, and as they get older, they increasingly figure out Mr. Kraski's not really all there when it comes to that. How about players being prepared to play in the heat? What should the players and their parents be thinking about as summer is cropping up here, Dr. Johnson?
Well, all our coaches undergo heat training. There's mandatory through the Activity Association to do that. That's pretty strict these days, isn't it? It is pretty strict
because every year you hear these horror stories, and there was one at a junior college out west that KCUR Sam Zeff has talked a lot about offensive linemen collapsing and dying in the heat out west.
Right. Our coaches know we have ice and water available immediately to submerge someone who looks like they're dealing with heat-related issues. It's right there available to our athletes. It's centrally located. The trainer's in charge. Everybody kind of knows what the indicators are of getting too hot. And I think we have a pretty good protocol in place, but the first thing is being able to identify the indicators.
Mm-hmm. And what are some of those indicators?
Well, I think some of those indicators for our coaches are they sluggish? Do they look different than where they are? Are they complaining about, how they feel? And one of the big areas is immediately contact the trainer, and when in doubt, go take them to the tub and put them in the ice water.
Yeah. Didn't I used to take salt tablets when I was a young football player in junior high and high school? I mean, that's just the opposite of what you're supposed to do, right?
And they told you not to drink water.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, no, it's totally changed. Drink as much water as you can and make sure you're hydrated.
What concerns do you have as the summer season approaches, Dr. Goldstein?
Yeah, hydrating before the day of the event. So if you're expecting to be practicing on a Saturday, you should be starting to think about hydrating on a Thursday night or Friday.
Really?
Don't drink a glass of water right when you're going to the event and think that was enough. And making sure that, cramps can be a sign of the beginnings of dehydration. Vomiting can be a sign of the beginnings of dehydration. Stopping sweating is a serious sign. And so there are some signs that happen before an emergency. But just know that as a sports injury or illness, dehydration is 100% preventable. Mm-hmm. Drinking water, Gatorade, eliminating energy drinks that have caffeine or sugar or taurine in them, and sticking to Gatorades and Powerades and waters, and knowing that water is the most important thing. If your activity is an hour or less, water's all you need. Start the day before, and make sure that you're urinating the same amount of time, the same frequency as you always do.
But what if you're working out every day, you're preparing for the football season, and practices are a daily thing?
Yep.
You're talking about a lot of water here.
It's a lot of water, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And monitoring your weight. Your weight shouldn't change after a practice. It should stay about the same as your pre-exercise weight. And watching your urine output, that you're still peeing at the end of the workout. Mm-hmm. Those that stop sweating or that can't go to the bathroom, those are real hints that we're not going the right direction. Right.
Which sport, Dr. Johnson, tends to cause the most injuries? Is it still football, or is it something else?
Well, I think those are the ones because we have the most players on the football team, and those would be the ones that would indicate to be the greatest number. But we obviously have injuries all over the place. Gymnastics and basketball and soccer, you name it, we have them. But, we have 100 football players out.
What's the most common injury you see?
Well, other than the normal aches and pains, I would say the one that we're most focused on are concussions. I wouldn't say that that's the most common per se. There's injuries. But
again, the thinking there has evolved a lot the last 3-4 years, right?
Well, yeah, unbelievably so. And because, I was, and Dr. Goldstein and I had known each other for a long time on this, we were in part of that transition where, it got to the point where you had to rest your brain the same way you rest a muscle that was pulled. And so the idea that you couldn't go out and watch practice because you were being held out because of a concussion, coaches would get mad, parents would get mad, but it was different than the orthodoxy that we had all been taught. Mm-hmm. And now we understand the science of it a little bit better, and so there's a specific protocol to go through, and I think by and large people accept that, rely on it, and it becomes very effective.
Dr. Goldstein, what's your advice to parents who come to you and say, my son wants to play football, we're concerned about concussions, what do you advise? How do you handle
We need another
that?
half hour.
Yeah, I was wondering. Yeah.
That's a great topic. And boy, you can see both sides of the extreme on that. Mm-hmm. Football is an exciting sport that's part of the American backbone. And I love the sport as well. And yet the concussion numbers seem to keep rising. The science keeps coming out. And different advisory boards, as well as professionals like Dr. Cantu, who's a concussion expert, says we should be allowing kids to play flag football or touch football until the high school age, or they shouldn't be wearing helmets until a certain age, or we shouldn't be tackling on practices only during games. You can see the cons of all those things too. If you're not practicing, how do you get good at it? And if you're not learning to tackle at a young age, how do you expect to be good when you're in college? And there's certainly both sides to that. I will say that concussions are a hot topic and not only a big science topic, but a big media topic. And they're mostly put on football, but we know that it happens with bicycling, and we know it happens in soccer, and we know that it happens in every sport, and slipping on the ice in your driveway.
If a kid wants to play football or a young woman wants to play soccer, would you ever advise no out of fear of concussion?
No, that's a great question. I think today the recommendations that most sports doctors use is the number of concussions that someone's had or a concussion that hasn't resolved. Either they're still having symptoms, or their grades have dropped, or their personality has changed. And those are real red flags that perhaps we should be thinking about a sport that's non-contact. But I don't think that we should be running in fear of concussions if you've never had one, or because you're scared you might get one. Because, as I said, you could slip on the driveway in the ice and get a concussion. Concussions aren't 100% preventable, but we should be able to monitor the risk, and if the risk is too high, perhaps find something that's less risky or less contact.
I'm just wondering about your coaches at Shawnee Mission South, John, and you have a great football player, and he might get his bell rung, and you have to go through protocol and taken out of a game. Or, I mean, that's a lot of pressure on a coach who wants to win a game. You got your star player dinged up.
Well, I'll tell you how we relieve that pressure. I give 100% of the authority to the trainer to pull that player.
Okay.
And
it's not a coach's decision.
It's not a coach's decision. It's the trainer decision, and it is absolute. I've told every one of my coaches, when the trainer says they're off, they're off. You can argue.
There's
with
no
later.
arguing there.
If you want to argue later, but you're not going to argue now.
Yeah.
The state of Kansas and Missouri also have laws that are predictable in nature, that athletic trainers and coaches and athletic directors know that if there's a sign of a concussion, you don't have to diagnose it. You don't have to be the doctor to diagnose it. But if there's the sign of a concussion, they have to be pulled for at least 24 hours, and they can only return after they're sent back by a concussion provider. So I think that takes some of the pressure off of coaches, although the stress is still there if they want to be playing their best player, I understand. But some of the pressure gets taken off when the coach can tell the parent, you know what, it's the law. We have to take them off. We're not only doing it because it's the law, we're doing it because it's the best thing for your kid.
That's the voice of Dr. Randy Goldstein, a pediatrician and sports injury specialist over at St. Luke's. We are also joined by Dr. John Johnson, who serves as athletic director at Shawnee Mission South High School. Gentlemen, thanks for some great information. We sure appreciate it. Nice
Thank you,
job.
Steve.
Appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
You bet.